Let me start by unmuting, and then I will say hello and welcome, colleagues. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our 2022 Boston University School of Social Work Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series event, Community Organizing and Political Education, Impacts on BIPOC Youth Mental Health, with Amatullah, Mervin, and Tata Venkatraman. My name is Linda Sprague Martinez. I'm an associate professor at Boston University School of Social Work in the macro department. We are co-sponsoring this event with the Equity and Inclusion Committee and the clinical department in recognition of the false divide between clinical and macro practice social work. Our Equity and Inclusion Committee at Boston University includes all of the BU community stakeholders, including faculty, staff, students, administrators, and alumni. The committee has been around for more than 2 decades, engaging in work of building equity and inclusion and justice here at the school, as well as amplifying social justice focused activities here in the community. Some of the work of the committee, some of the work that the committee has engaged in includes organizing social justice learning communities, creating anti-oppressive teaching and learning labs, partnering with different departments around social justice focused interventions, student support, and solidarity circles, as well as mentoring for anti-oppressive teaching and practice. Equity and Inclusion has a wonderful resource page as well. It's available to anyone. It includes podcasts, peer-reviewed literature, and media articles. And I would encourage everyone to just check it out. It is a wealth of resources. Finally, we have on that website a link to a 3-hour online module on structural and institutional racism, again, available to anyone in the world. You can access many of these resources at our Equity and Inclusion webpage. So let's get to tonight. I'm briefly going to overview our format, then I will introduce Amatullah Mervin and Tara Venkatraman, and they will present for about 30 minutes. We'll then have 3 members of our BUSSW community offer a 1-minute reflection about the talk and ask Amatullah and Tara a couple of questions. They'll each ask 1 question for Tara and Amatullah. Finally, we'll be able to answer a few questions from our audience that you can type into the chat. Before we begin, I would like to review a few Zoom housekeeping items. So anyone who is receiving CEUs, you will need to keep your camera on during the entire session. If you are not receiving CEUs, we recommend turning your camera off during Amatullah and Tara's presentation. If you're receiving CEUs, you will need to complete the evaluation form. We will type it into the link. We'll put a link to the form in the chat at the end of the presentation, and we suggest having your Zoom setting on speaker view for the entire presentation. We'll be recording the presentation, so if you're not comfortable being recorded and you aren't receiving CEUs, you're welcome to keep your camera off, and we actually recommend that you keep it off during the presentation. We will be posting the recording on our E&I Speaker Series webpage a couple of days after the talk. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Please do not use the chat during Amatullah and Tara's presentation, as it can be distracting for speakers. Closed captioning is available for this event. You can access closed captioning through Zoom. If joining by computer, click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you click on live transcript, please click enable and start the closed captioning. If you're joining by phone, go to settings, then meeting, and then closed captioning. Finally, it goes without saying that all comments in the chat should be respectful and mindful of our entire BUSSW community. We'd like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement reminds us that colonization is an enduring reality, that Boston University sits on the stolen traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. If you are outside of Boston, take some time to learn about the tribal lands where you live and the ongoing movements to have land honored, acknowledged, and returned. The past 3 years have been challenging in so many ways, with COVID-19 unmasking the devastating long-term effects of racial capitalism, transphobia, classism, gender inequality. The timing of Amatullah and Tara's talk couldn't be more appropriate for our historical moment, where we as social workers, part of the world community, stand at a crossroad. In this political moment and throughout our country's history, Black young people and young people of color are on the forefronts of insurgent social movements for justice. However, youth are also experiencing the repercussions of devastating racial and police violence and ongoing governmental neglect in ways that have inevitable impacts on their mental health. Our speakers tonight, Amatullah Mervin, School of Theology, Class of 22, and Tara Venkatraman, will engage us in an important discussion on strategies for activism and organizing rooted in collective care, and the ways which activism and organizing and political education themselves can be mental health care practices. The speakers will also share their research on how mental health for Black youth and youth of color is impacted by political education and organizing work, as they offer best practices for mental health practitioners, social workers, and organizers, as well as youth workers. Amatullah Mervin, she, hers, is a Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts native. She is experienced in youth and community organizing, social justice, program development, and organizational leadership. As a youth and community organizer for more than 10 years, which is hard to believe by her youth, her work has placed her at the center of supporting young people, recognizing their power and using that power to fight for liberation and grassroots movements. She has successfully worked on numerous campaigns, both in the city of Boston and around the nation, including, but not limited to, Youth Way on the MBTA, ending stop and frisk in New York City, and the work to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. Her sheroes include Fannie Lou Hamer, Assata Shakur, and Ella Baker, and she models much of her work after their ideology and methodology. She holds a BA in sociology and a master's in theological studies from Boston University. Tara Deviki Venkatraman is a director of programs and strategy at the city school and a youth worker, organizer, political educator, and therapist. She has been rooted in the Boston area racial justice, youth organizing for almost 15 years, and has worked at the city school since 2011, where she supports political education, leadership development, and organizing work with young people and young adults of color. Data is also on the steering committee for a partnership between the City School and Boston Liberation Health that aims to design a community-based mental health response for Boston that does not involve the police. She is organized with Youth Justice and Power, with the Youth Justice and Power Union in their campaign to defund the police and reinvest in youth jobs and community needs. And she has a therapy practice focused on young adults and adults of color. I have been fortunate to partner with both Amatullah and Tara on several amazing projects, including our own BU Center for Anti-Racist Research grant. And I am also excited for their presentation this evening because we have so much to learn about how community organizing and political education can be positive mental health interventions. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming both Tara and Amatullah to the Equity Inclusion Speaker Series.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It is so lovely to see your faces and the names we can see and the pictures of folks here. If someone could start the presentation, that would be great. Beautiful. Thank you so much. So as we are journeying into this together, just a reminder on the title of our research: community organizing and political education, particularly on the impacts of BIPOC youth and their mental health. My name is Amatullah Mervin, and I use the She series, and I'll pass it over to Tara to introduce herself. Next slide, please, also.
Thanks, Amatullah. Hi, everybody. It's so good to be here with you all. I see so many familiar faces and names. Really joyful that you all could join us. My name is Tara Venkatraman, and I use she and her pronouns. And thank you, Linda, for the wonderful introduction, too. It's been a joy to work with you and Don and other folks on this project.
Thanks, Tara. If we could go to the next slide, we're going to get started. So we're going to start with who we are. As you heard from Linda, both myself and Tara have been in youth organizing and youth work and youth development work for quite some time. We have a long history and a commitment to youth organizing and young people doing social justice work. And so we want to center ourselves in that work as we think about the research that we did. So we primarily do this now through the City School, which focuses primarily on supporting young people to think about the ways in which they can do social justice work, organizing, politically educate their peers, and really to become social change agents, right? Our work is to support young people to develop themselves and to have the kind of advocacy and agency that they can explore outside of our sort of walls and our spaces. And our work is not just one that is in the context of our organization, but is deeply rooted in the larger Boston youth justice movement. This is not an organization I'm referring to, but more largely speaking, the work that young people are doing in the city of Boston to shift the systems that they're having to interact with, whether that be education, transportation, gentrification in their communities, and generally speaking, the systems that they are engaging with every day. And so we hope that we offer to you not just information about the research, but ground you in some of the work that we do contextually. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. So we've also wanted to start with some framing, a little bit like, why is this research important, right? Why does it matter to us? And why does it matter to the larger youth organizing movement? Anyone who's been connected to youth organizing in the last 10, 15 years knows that the coin youth organizing or the coin term youth organizing is actually pretty recent, right? It's not that young people haven't been organizing, but the term, I think, folks have just in the last 20, 30 years have been able to coin this term and this framing. And so what we've seen is that there's a disconnect between the ways in which we are organizing and seeing that in direct correlation between young people's mental health and really folks' mental health in general. And what we were clear about was, how can we understand our organizing work to dismantle systems of oppression if we are not clear on the ways in which folks are engaging in societies in the first place, right? If we're not talking about folks' mental health and the ways that they're organizing, and these are separate conversations, how do these things get to a place of pushing us toward liberation? It's very hard for them to do that. And so we wanted to have the conversation about how they're deeply connected and the ways in which it can improve a young person or a young adult's mental health to do organizing work. What we needed and what we've sort of realized and what we thought we wanted to assess a little bit more was universal access, right? We are so clear that it is not helpful for us to say, well, come organize with us, but we won't take care of, or we won't support you in making sure that you have food, making sure that you have access to transportation, making sure that you have the resources that you need to be here fully with yourself, especially since the communities that we're working with and that we support are most directly impacted by the issues we're fighting against. And so we really believe in universal access, rather that's language justice, rather that is making sure that font is accessible to folks, and what that looks like for support. And then finally here, what grounds us is a core principle, particularly around collective care. And I just want to name that collective care really is an organizing strategy by folks most impacted by the work. It is not an updated version of self-care. It is not, well, I'm just drinking water. As you can see, there is a young person here drinking water. It was work that she had to do with several other young people to collectively take care of each other and make sure that they can engage in our program, right? This idea that our priorities are really steeped in our well-being is really important and crucial to us. And we know that this only happens in collective formation. And so I'll pass to Tara to talk a little bit about our methods. And if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great.
Thanks, Amatullah. Yes, so we came into this research project really with a question that is woven throughout our praxis, which is the question of how engaging in organizing and political education for young people, especially young people who are Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color, how it impacts their mental health to engage in organizing and political education work. And we obviously had our hypotheses about that around that question, but we were interested in some of the nuances of what parts of organizing and political education impact young people's mental health in which ways. And so the researchers among us will want to know what were the methods, and hopefully we all want to know what were the methods. So we used a few different approaches to the work that are deeply tied to the approaches that we already take to working with young people at the city school. And that includes a train the trainer model, the work that's rooted in popular education, and using the liberation health approach, which is work we had started to take on prior to even this research project. So the train the trainer model, to speak a little bit more about that, looked like training a group of our youth and young adult staff in the liberation health model and in participatory evaluation methods and participatory research methods. And so that group of young people and young adult staff actually then went on to train all of the staff in our summer program in the liberation health model. So all of them as youth workers could use the liberation health model with young people in the program. And in case you aren't familiar with the Liberation Health Model, this is a great time to talk about it. So the Liberation Health Model is an approach that was developed by Don Belton Martinez and other folks, including folks in the Boston Liberation Health Group. And it's a model that looks at challenging the idea of individualized mental health experiences and broadening the frame to a sociopolitical frame. So looking not just at the personal factors, which is what we traditionally look at when we think about mental health, but looking also at the ideological and cultural messaging that contributes to people's mental health challenges, as well as the institutional and systemic realities that exacerbate and deeply create people's mental health challenges and experiences. So we looked at that frame, which has tremendous alignment to the work that we do around unpacking systems of oppression at the city school. And we use that approach to revitalize our youth support model and to look at the experiences that young people were having. So we use the Liberation Health Model throughout our summer work, including in our family groups, which are small group spaces within the program that young people practice collective care and deepen their relationships with adult staff and mentors. We practiced using the Liberation Health Model to the challenges that they were naming and experiencing, that they were naming in those family groups. And then at the end of the summer, we did some focus groups with our youth and young adult staff to hear about their experiences in how organizing and political education had impacted their mental health. And we also did surveys with the young people who at the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer. And just in terms of the focus groups, I also want to name for folks who are less familiar with the city school that a majority of our staff, part of our ladder of leadership is that a majority of our staff are graduates of the program, and all of our staff come out of youth organizing work more broadly and the Boston Youth Justice Movement more broadly. So when they were interviewed, they were reflecting not only on their experience in supporting young people in the program, but also in their own experiences coming up through youth organizing and political education work. So drum roll, please. Here is the moment of presentation around what were the results of this study. And so we can go to the next slide. All right, so no huge shock here that the kind of overall takeaway is that most young people did report that engaging in organizing and political education made their mental health better. But what is much more interesting to us actually is the nuances of the conversation and the nuances of the results. So we had a few kind of parts that we uncovered in the course of looking at the data, and we did co-analyze the data along with our incredible research team. That's an important part of the methods too. I just want to read a few quotes as we look through the results here. So one of the quotes in terms of just young people's experience in organizing and political education and how it contributed to their mental health. A young adult said, as a young person, 15 years old, as a young person, 15 years old, political education and organizing was really positively impactful for my mental health. It felt like all the things I've been thinking about are real and what I see is true. It empowered me to push back on authority figures to find my voice. And what I want to highlight there is one of the things we talk about on the social work and therapy side of things is the importance of validating people's lived experience and validating people's realities. And political education serves that function. It is validating young people's lived experience of the systems and helping to validate that this is real, that they are not making up their experiences of oppression. But then they also can feel empowered to challenge and push back, which is a critical part of organizing. So that validation supports their resistance. And another quote that I want to read is, being around lots of people that have different identities than me has allowed me to expand and grow. I've become more knowledgeable, which has made me more confident in talking and presenting / sharing out in big groups. It's given me a clearer understanding of the world. So what we're hearing in these quotes from young people is both the importance of being in a multiracial, multi-identity community that has both affinity spaces and accountability spaces, but also the fact that more knowledge equals more confidence, and like all of that is contributing to people's, again, validation of their reality of their experience of this world. So a few other things I want to highlight in terms of the results are that we really heard a theme about the importance of hearing about the history of organizing. And learning about the history of organizing helped participants understand that they were part of a very long history of shared struggle. So they weren't the first people to encounter systems of oppression or try to figure out how to change them, but actually there's a long history and a long tradition of organizing around and fighting against these systems. And that people with marginalized identities have always fought, and this is everyone's vision, as in there's a shared vision and a broader movement that young people are a part of. So folks highlighted that as one key theme. Another key theme that we've started to speak about is the importance of learning and practicing collective care. So not just theoretically learning about it, but actually getting to practice it in the context of the program. And we get to practice things like doing a modeling of mutual aid in the program, where young people get to say what their needs are and what they would like to offer to each other. And we create systems where that can happen. Participating in collective care challenges, where young people get to challenge each other and themselves to practice collective care in different ways. And so we heard over and over again that that was a really important part of learning about racial and social justice, that those things were deeply connected. And the quote there says, "I've learned that it's okay to prioritize myself. Collective care has become a major part of my life. And also knowing how to meet my needs has helped me to better myself." And the last thing that we want to highlight is the importance of collective praxis. So not just around collective care, but actually getting to work on teams where multiple staff, for example, were supporting young people together, or young people were getting to process through information and learning together. So for example, some of the approach we take with accountability processes with young people, and part of the way that we practice transformative justice is that we do have individualized support. We do have one-to-ones with young people, but in cases where we need more support, we also bring in multiple staff members to talk with a young person and are clear and transparent about why we're doing that. And we've started to rely less on one-to-one or individualized support and more on the family group as a space of practice together. And Amatullah will speak a little bit more to that as a best practice. And so we really heard over and over again that co-development, that staff could support each other in supporting young people was a really key part. And we also heard over and over again from young people that the family group space was the primary space where they felt their mental health was positively impacted in the course of the summer. And again, those are small group spaces, maybe 3 to 4 young people and 1 staff member, where they really got to process through information more deeply, but also get to hear about each other's lives, get to connect around how they wanted support in the program, and get to talk about their goals. So that's collaborative space for praxis was really critical for youth and staff development. The last thing I want to highlight is that in no way do we want to paint the picture that this is we don't want to romanticize the kind of findings or results here. There were certainly significant challenges that people highlighted with their experience in organizing and political education work, and significant questions that people raised. And honestly, they wouldn't have been part of political education spaces if they weren't raising significant critical thinking questions. So we want to highlight those as well. Some of the realities are folks speaking to the fact that the content of engaging in learning about racism, capitalism, and all the systems of oppression can be really emotionally challenging. And the question of what it means to be a youth worker and pushing young people around those things is a really important question. Frankly, we expect so much of young people in learning about racism and all of these systems. We often expect more of them than most adults, but then is expected of most adults. And so I think people raised really important questions about where are the lines between pushing and holding young people accountable and leaving them room to grow and feel supported and cared for. And that's an important question that we'll continue to grapple with. And people also highlighted some of the structural limitations and challenges that grassroots youth organizing groups face, including challenges around pay and resources, and the fact that youth organizing has been underfunded, and then challenges with burnout, challenges with taking on this really important work and often feeling either low collective capacity or low individual capacity to follow and carry it through. And we'll speak a little more to it at the end as well. But I want to pass it to Amatullah to highlight some of the best practices, which were additional learnings and out of the results.
Thanks, Tara. My favorite part, best practices. I would hope that some of you or all of you know a youth worker, someone who's ever worked with young people, and you know we live by best practices. They're always growing and developing, but this is how we do our work, right? Is to have a set of things that we, in some ways, are standardized in doing so that we can meet the needs of people. So the first thing really is actually centered around social workers. We wanted to name something that feels really tangible for social workers and clinicians and therapists to do, which is be organizable. This is not to say that you have to go out tomorrow and be like, I'm gonna become the best organizer against racial injustice or racial capitalism. It is not to say that by any stretch. However, being connected to organizing movements, grassroots organizations, and community organizations that have member bases where especially young people and young adults are, really makes a difference in your therapeutic practice and your ability to support young people who are already doing this work. It also creates room for you to be able to support young people in being connected to organizations that can further their development and further their work, and strengthens what you're able to do with them in your own sort of practice. And so being able to draw on the rest of the practices that we'll talk about and the few other points here will make it easier for you to be able to do these things if you're already connected to organizations and spaces where you can tap in and support the work folks are doing. The second is collaboration. We really believe in collaboration, particularly around youth support. If you've ever talked to me or ever talked to Tara, we fundamentally believe that thinking about young people's support is moving away from saviorism and actually developing strong collective care and transformative justice models for young people to be as powerful as they can be, right? That's not doing it for them, but creating room and space for them to be able to do that in collaborative efforts. And that means you being able to do it with them, as well as them being able to do it with other trusting adults and other young people, and just largely the communities that they're in. And then the second part is really around strong supervision and training models. We believe in strong supervision, strong coaching, especially to young adults. As Tara mentioned, a good portion of the young people that we support are supported by young adults who already came through our program. So you could imagine the amount of fun we have telling them, you're not in the program anymore, but we're here to coach you and support you in this work, right? So being able to build out those strong systems really matters. Then we have political education in a two-part in this top yellow and bottom part here, which is to really make sure that we are doing the work of developing people in their political education, especially around organizing history by way of grassroots movements. So what we know is to romanticize movements does not help us, right? We have to be able to talk intricately and in great depth about the ways in which movements have moved over the course of history, and be able to talk about the complexities of racism and sexism in movements, from everything from Occupy Wall Street, right, to the Black Panthers. Like, what does it mean to have these conversations and engage with them in ways that are tangible and important? And then we have affinity groups, which is, I think, one of the places in which we do a lot of our self-work. So we prioritize doing racial, gender, and sexual orientation affinity groups. And these are spaces where young people and young adults have the ability to deconstruct some of the things that they've walked into spaces believing. As you heard Tara mention, there's a young person who's like, wow, I got to be in this space and got to understand what it means to not just sort of surround the world with myself, right, but beyond me. And to be able to think about what does me being in spaces look like, feel like, and how do I use that as a tool for transforming spaces, as well as creative arts, as you can see in, I think, the top right and the bottom right. We really believe in creative arts. It's something that I think we've done an even better job at this summer because we believe it's a tool to support folks with moving toward liberatory practices and engaging in liberatory work more generally speaking. Then we have what actually probably is my favorite best practice, relationship building. If you are not relationship building, you are not organizing. It's just the truth. Feel free to quote me. Feel free to test me on it. Relationship building is extremely important. And what we know is that for young people in particular, smaller spaces where young people are able to build on their collective care practices and challenges and build strong relationships with each other creates room for them to not only have these hard conversations, but to be able to challenge themselves and those around them to do the work of being organizers and moving toward the liberation that they see for themselves and their communities. And then we have relationship building for youth workers. As we've mentioned before, we want to make sure that youth support structures are rooted in collective power. And there's space for adults to support young people. I don't believe that young people know everything, but if you know me, you know I believe that young people know a lot. And so it is extremely important for us to create room and space where they can have conversations, say things that might sound problematic actually, and be able to engage with the tensions of that. And so we're naming here for youth workers to be able to relationship build so that those moments of contention and the moments of like really great moments can move toward places of power. I will pass to Tara as we move to close.
Thanks, Amatullah, for walking us through that. And yes, we've been really excited to be in these discussions and conversation, and we're excited to hear the reflections from the reflectors and then continue the conversation with you all. Just as we close, we'll say that we know this research is, of course, limited in scope. It's 1 year's worth of research on a huge field and a field which there can always be more research on. And it's not one that has been as looked at in the field of social work and in social science research. So it feels really exciting to be in this project, and it's also inherently limited in that way. And we have some of the questions that we mentioned earlier, including the kind of distinctions around where and how to push young people and hold them accountable in the context of supporting young people's mental health and young adults' mental health. And some of the questions about burnout in particular, and where are the lines between burnout from organizing and burnout from the experiences of systemic racial capitalism and other systems. Some of those are questions we're going to continue to take into our practice, and we look forward to being in further conversation with everyone around those. We just want to thank everyone for being part of this learning process with us, and for taking the time to hear our reflections and hear our learning, which is certainly ongoing. If you were excited about or inspired by anything you heard today and you're not already in relationship with City School, we would just invite you to be in a deeper relationship with us. And I always like to say that we would not be connected to organizing work if we did not make asks. So I'm going to make a couple asks. I would invite you to go to our website, and I would invite you to consider making a donation to us. Donations are obviously a big part of the way that grassroots racial justice organizations sustain our work. And so please feel free to do that. But we are also looking for support in a few other ways, including that we have some volunteer opportunities, including our board of directors currently open, and we are hiring. So if you know amazing people who would want to work with us, please consider sharing that opportunity with them as well. But really want to thank you for supporting us by being part of this conversation today. And lastly, I just want to note that two of the other folks who were involved in this project, Batiel and Kimberly, who I think had to jump off, but was on a little bit earlier, were integral parts of making this happen. So just want to also thank both of them. You probably, well, if you know them, you saw them in the pictures that we went through just now, but huge thank you to you two, and then also to Don and Linda and other folks on our team, without which this really couldn't have happened. We look forward to hearing some other reflections, and thank you all again.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful presentations. Thank you so much, Tara and Amatullah. We are really excited about your presentation and to get into some discussion about it and the fact that if you're not in relationship, you're not organizing. I like that quote. I'm going to be quoting Amatullah Mervin for a long time. So with that, I want to introduce our first reflector, Orion Ohala, pronouns they, them. Orion is a second-year Master of Social Work student with clinical concentration at Boston University School of Social Work. They use their background in humanities to explore individualized care opportunities that focus on psychological and material narratives, systems, and ideologies that shape each person's life. Orion served as a coordinator for residential education at the University of California, Santa Cruz for 3 years, where their set of colleagues incorporated a set of themes of social justice and community and international and global perspectives in developing residential curriculums. Orion hopes to continue to find pathways and communities to engage in intercultural and abolitionist praxis. With that, I will turn it over to Orion, who will offer a 1-minute reflection on the talk and ask a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your talk tonight, Amatullah and Tara. It was very wonderful and inspiring to me as someone who works mostly with adults and a call in to work better with youth in the future. And I'm really sitting with the key themes that y'all had mentioned about young people getting a sense of the history of ongoing struggle and movement and what it means to grapple with that. And Amatullah, I'm called in by your thought that youth often know so much already, but this is where we do some of the education to kind of help validate and affirm some of the thoughts that they're experiencing in the day-to-day moments. And I'm sitting with some of these experiences that they may have seeking this type of validation and affirmation either through history, but also in our current moment when we have attacks on critical race theory, on social emotional learning, on so many things that want to keep youth away from engaging with this critical thought and critical resistance work. So my reflection and question for you all today is, in a world where people are going to continuously push back and say, youth should not be exposed to these ideas, youth shouldn't be thinking about critical race theory, they shouldn't be thinking about the radical politics of doing this work practically day to day, how do you all push back both practically and structurally in the work that you do?
Thanks for that reflection and question. I think I'm going to start and Tara will maybe add here. I think the first thing that comes to mind is really creating space for youth power, right? A lot of spaces offer room for young people to come and like do generally good activities, like I shouldn't say it like this, but like make bracelets, which is like really great because we made bracelets this summer. But to create room and space for young people to feel safe to have in-depth conversation makes a difference. When you start to think about the ways in which young people can be removed from what ultimately is adultist rhetoric and practice, and create room for them to be able to just converse and think about the systems, there is more room for them to be able to engage in what I would identify as youth power, right? So I think that one of the biggest things I would name is creating space. I also think that there's a reality that adults need to get out of their own way. A lot of adults exist in a cynicism about the world that is well, I don't think we're going to get there. We're never going to make it. And in reality, a lot of people have lived enough years to know that we are struggling here. But to move away from the possibility that there's no solutions and that young people or people in general don't have the solutions that they need to live in better communities, like moving away from that really matters. And so I think being able to deconstruct some of the theories and ideologies that we have as adults to create room for young people to be in spaces where they can see the world and be like, oh, there is a world that I can create, right? A liberatory place and space that comes only by me making sure that I'm centered, I'm affirmed, and I'm in these spaces to do that work.
Yeah, I echo that. The only thing I might add here is that when we think about kind of institutionalized attacks and institutionalized white supremacist and transphobic attacks on things on educational spaces like having critical race theory in schools, I think it can be important and helpful to remember also that we're at a time where Information about racial and gender and economic and queer justice is being proliferated extremely widely by young people, and that they have tremendous access to that information. Young people are coming into our programming in a completely different place than they were 10 years ago, and certainly in a completely different place when they were 20 years ago when I was in high school, terrifyingly enough. And so I say that to say that as much as these institutionalized attacks are critical to pay attention to and that part of the landscape of our political education work, it's also important to remember the levels of grassroots political education, for lack of a better way of framing it, that young people are engaging with all the time and sharing information with each other all the time as well. And I think that's a helpful piece to hold on to.
Thank you so much, Orion and Dara and Amatullah. I'm going to go now to our second reflector. Emi Takanami is a macro social worker, or she/her is a macro social worker and community organizer, and currently serves as the Racial Justice Policy and Community Engagement Manager at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. She is also a steering committee member of Boston Liberation Health, a group of social workers dedicated to understanding and practicing social work using Liberation Health Framework, a model of radical health practice that helps individuals identify and analyze the sociopolitical factors affecting our lives and take into action to change our external world. Before joining FXB Center, Emi served as the Policy and Community Organizing Director at Zero Debt Massachusetts, a new nonprofit that she helped start up, dedicated to the abolition of student debt and transformation of higher education system here in Massachusetts through community organizing and grassroots advocacy. And she now serves on their board of directors. Emi, I'll turn it over to you for your 1-minute reflection and question.
Thanks, Linda, and thank you, Amatullah and Tara, for your presentation and just all of the amazing work you both are co-leading at the City School with the young people that you work with. And before I dive into potentially 2 long-winded questions, I just want to share a quick reflection that I've personally been thinking a lot about lately as someone who's still enmeshed in academia, unfortunately, which is the way that some ideas may be new to the academy, but not new at all, right, to those on the ground with lived experience on the issues being studied. And whether that be, theories like community organizing and political education as a form of therapeutic intervention, or even just our language, like Amatullah, you shared earlier in the presentation around the coining of the term youth organizing. That doesn't necessarily mean that youth were not organizing prior to the shift in our language, and that those in the academy may need things like published research papers to validate those ideas or theories, but how that might not be necessary, right, for folks to embody those truths. And how do we ensure that we're validating those truths as well, which I think y'all are doing and modeling every day at the City School. So gratitude to the 2 of you, and again, for all your youth workers there. So I have 2 quick questions. In the interest of time, please feel free to just pick one to respond to. But and I know where to find both of you, so I will be asking for responses to the other question later on. My first question is just around institutions like our medical industrial complex or higher education industrial complex. Are they ever going to be able to fully acknowledge and share this conception of mental health care as something that includes organizing and political education? Because, right, that would inherently necessitate that they acknowledge that we're actually working to upend the kind of society which necessitates therapists in the super individualistic ways in which they're conceived today. And also it kind of necessitates that they acknowledge that these are skills and tools that anyone can learn and practice and share, not just gatekeeper professions like social work that end up actually making a profit off of, right, our current for-profit mental health care system. So, this fabulous talk is being co-hosted tonight by BU School Social Work, where I received my formal social work education. So I'm just curious, do you feel like social work schools and institutions of formal education have a role to play in promoting this conception of organizing and poly-ed as therapeutic interventions? And just to take it one step further, right, like a concern that's always on the forefront of organizers' minds is there a way in which the findings of your research could be misused or co-opted by the ruling class, right, either by further downplaying or defunding more individualistic therapeutic interventions that are unfortunately still needed as long as we still live under racial capitalism, or maybe like prescribing forms of organizing that aren't rooted in liberatory analysis that you all bring to this work, or is co-option like so far from our worries at this point in time because of where we're at and our limited conception of what therapeutic interventions can look like. And I'll quickly get to my second question, which wasn't super the focus of tonight's presentation, but it was mentioned in the intros, the project of co-facilitating a community-led design group process to draft a crisis response model outside of police for the city of Boston that you all were involved in this past year. So I'm actually really interested in the overlap between these projects that you both are working on. So kind of making the case, right, that organizing rooted in collective care is a form of mental health care, and collectively building out local crisis response intervention models and forms of safety outside of policing. And I just finished No More Cops that just came out by Kava and Richie. And I really feel like their ultimate argument, in my view, was that deep interpersonal community-based relationships and trust are the best way to actually begin building up genuine safety outside of the carceral state. And that carceral state, of course, including police, but also other professions that uphold the carceral state, like mandated reporters, many of which are social workers. So all to say, have you all thought about kind of how the findings from both your projects can inform each other, the ways in which more practices of collective care, whether that's through organizing, mutual aid, other practices, are actually building up safety outside of policing? And on the other hand, how working and organizing toward and building out alternatives to policing in and of itself actually might be experienced as therapeutic to some community members who may have directly been impacted by the harms and violence of policing.
Thanks, Amy. There's so much in what you shared. And I'm glad you mentioned that you know where to find us, because we definitely will not be able to respond to the full scope of that. But thank you for also highlighting the work we're doing around the community facilitation process for developing the non-police mental health crisis response, because that's work we're very excited about. We'd love to do a whole other presentation. We will be doing many other community conversations about that. So I'll put a plug in that for people to continue to look out for that. I think I would say a couple things, and then I'm very excited to hear Amatullah's responses too. As somebody who has also been through and trained as a social worker and currently practicing therapy alongside my work at the city school, I feel like the links are very deeply understood within organizing political education spaces, particularly those that work with young people. And I was surprised by the degree to which this conversation felt really absent. I didn't go into social work school naive. I didn't think this was going to be everyone's framework, but I was surprised by the degree to which this conversation wasn't at least part of my social work training and education. I did also have a clinical, like a particularly clinically focused training, but even so, it's so deeply relevant. And so I would say that I think the concerns about co-optation are real. And I also think the absence of understanding organizing and political education as mental health interventions really stems from the kinds of the ways in which academia is, as you spoke to, like embedded in norms of white supremacy culture and in the academic industrial complex and other things, because those ways of getting mental health care through community are deeply embedded in most people's experience, but they're not codified in research. And so I don't know that I've yet seen the conversations in academic spaces progress to the point where I feel concerned about co-optation. And I wish that that weren't the kinds of constant worry that we had to engage with, is like the worry about trying to capture like for institutional memory and for practitioners. Like we want to capture this knowledge for practitioners. We want to capture it for ourselves and for young people and for folks who can support our work, but it does feel like a real concern. So anyway, that's the piece I'll say on co-optation. In terms of the organizing itself, the points of overlap on these projects, I think it's been really critical for City School to get to frame and conceptualize our work as it is, and also in the impacts it has on people's mental health. And I think that our work at the core is deeply about building community safety in a way that is outside of policing and that is directly tied to communities not needing and like never benefiting from police. I would also say that it was really great to see the young people organize around the non-police crisis response model, and we saw that this summer. So young people, for example, like designed a survey about what youth needs were in the mental health crisis response model for Boston, and what young people would be most likely to call or to reach out to or engage with. And they did their own canvassing. Again, shout out to Betiel, who organized this whole part of the project. But they did canvassing of other young people and got over 160 young people to fill out the survey. So youth voice was represented and captured in this model. And I think that that felt like an important piece that the city school can offer, is that the mental health crisis response model for Boston is going to account for youth needs in a way that nationally young people haven't always been part of the conversation about non-police mental health crisis response. And I think that was powerful for people's experience, like young people's own experience of their ability to make change. And we're certainly going to be continuing to organize around that implementation moving forward. I will pass it to Amatullah to hear whatever wisdom you have in response.
Thanks, Tara. And thanks, Amy, for the reflections on the question. I think the piece that stands out to me is this piece around like co-optation. I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is the professionalization of organizing. Like, I actually have very deep concerns around it. I think the idea that you can go to certain colleges and get a certificate in organizing is very strange to me, like deeply, deeply strange. Do I think it's a terrible thing? No. But do I see it potentially creating room for people to be like, well, I'm an organizer because I went and trained for 6 months. And I'm like, were you on the ground with people? Were you building relationships with people? Did you do one-to-ones? Do you know what a campaign map is, right? I personally have real questions for how the academy and institutions engage with the professionalization of organizing and grassroots movements. I think it's very tricky. I think the piece that could be good about it is folks move beyond activism. It's not that I have a problem with activism, but I think that there is a reality that it's easier to tap into activism because you can be quickly mobilized through certain like issue-based campaigns very quickly. You can be out on the streets for Black Lives Matter. You can be on the streets for issues of housing. The move to have people become organizers and as part of a base is deeply connected to their ability to support the needs of the communities that they're in and the issues that they're facing. And then I think the last thing I'd add here is just, I think that there are some models in which there are communities and institutions that are doing this somewhat well. I think as also a graduate of BU, I've seen moments and spaces and times in the School of Theology where I felt like part of the work of especially decentralizing like Christo-Eurocentric ideology was the work and the embodiment of people being able to organize in other communities and come back and name that in a School of Theology. And so I imagine some of that work is happening even by way of this conversation we're having in the School of Social Work. And I think, unfortunately, some of these conversations and overlaps are anomalies, but I don't think that we're going to be able to keep them separate forever, especially because there are phenomenal people that are in the academy that are like, I want to be involved, I want to engage, and I want to offer my support.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy and Amatullah and Dada, for wonderful question, wonderful response. I'm going to go to our third reflector, our faculty reflector. We have Dr. Daniel Jacobson Lopez, who is an assistant professor at Boston University School of Social Work. Dr. Lopez is also a visiting faculty at Yale in the School of Public Health and a Reeds Fellow, as well as a CIRA, Reeds Fellow at CIRA at Yale. Sorry, a lot of acronyms. His research examines how sociopolitical systems engage with gay, Latino, or Black sexual assault survivors and the health services provided to them. He also researches the effects of COVID-19 on people living with HIV/AIDS, and most recently is involved in research regarding and reducing social stigma against Ghanaian MSM. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jacobson Lopez to offer a 1-minute reflection and to ask one question.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. I was on mute. Sorry about that. So thank you both, first and foremost, for the work you're doing and really supporting Black and other youth of color. Right, as Peter just mentioned, much needed, especially during this time, but during any time, right, in history and contemporarily as well. So one aspect that really stood out to me was the different models you talked about, where liberation health model, obviously founded by Dr. Belkin Martinez, and the different forms that you have your work in. I think that's really important because a lot of times hear about community work, but not so much about the framework. So I think that was just really one of the strengths and that you elaborated on so well and really, I think, has helped strengthen so much of the research that you're doing and engagement, right, that you're doing with the youth. Another part that really stood out to me was talk about the validation, right? When you talked about unpacking systems of oppression and needing to validate, because I think that is so important for adults as well, but particularly for youth, and validating their pain and trauma, which is beneath everything, I think, most of the time. So one of my questions was, and being that you have that intersectional framework, was there a particular ism or form of oppression that youth belonging to multiple marginalized identities had more trouble unpacking? And also, when we talked about the validation, were there any areas of their identities that were less validated than others? So let's say they were LGBT and Black, were they at times more validated for one or the other, or was it sort of when you can't parse them out, which is I found to be often the case?
Thank you so much, Daniel. Great reflections and question. I'm going to try my best to answer, and Tara, I'm sure will add. I think that I'd like to say that we specialize. I don't think we're perfect at it. I think we specialize heavily in racial justice work. So when it comes to racial affinities, I think we're really strong in that. I think the same is true about gender affinities. I think that we have a lot of resources and support and a lot of people who have really fed into our work and our curriculum to develop and support young people. Where I think we lack, which then also creates room for young people to have a hard time, especially in a very homophobic and transphobic country and world, is conversations around sexual orientation and gender fluidity and space and room. And so I think there are young people who are like, I live in my Black identity and I've understood that and I get that to whatever degree that is. And then there are also spaces where they'll get into much smaller groups for sexual orientation or gender. And there are more questions to grapple with. I personally am not in those spaces as a cis heterosexual woman, but I have seen the impacts on staff and young people, the ways in which grappling with these questions in smaller groups and trying to do that in ways that's not harmful, actually, or doesn't further create room for other folks in the space to harm our most oppressed and most not supported folks outside in the world, being able to be their full selves, true selves, while also being able to move through the fluidity of their identity formation. I hope that answers the question or part of it.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I just want to add a little bit to that. I think that as a program that tries to do both affinity and accountability work in terms of each intersection of identity, I really agree with Amatullah that one of the places that we are continuing to really hold folks accountable is to addressing sexism in the program, and that in our community more broadly, and that continues to be a focal point for us. And I think as part of our gender justice work, I think gender justice, especially across genders, is a space that needs a lot of further development in our movement more broadly, as well as in the youth movement. And so I think continuing to work at that feels very parallel to that. I will say a real point of joy for us this summer was just the size of the queer young people of color affinity and how much that space is growing and how much more affinity and support young queer folks can receive from each other and from our incredible staff team, and just really valuing this space for queer justice that is growing within our program has been a really beautiful thing. So those kind of have coexisted simultaneously, I think. But I think what you're speaking to, I do think there's a lot of room for young folks to hold all of their identities within like youth movement space more broadly, including the city school. But I think that around privileged and power identities, as with everything, young folks, those are aspects of identity that young folks are maybe less likely to own and hold on to. And I think that's true for all of us. I hope that makes sense. So like, and I think young people will lead with identities that they have kind of processed through and are processing through in the context of the program, which can include their racial identity, and are less likely to hold those spaces in their identities that have more privilege, which might include class, might include being cis, might include being heterosexual, if any of those. That adds a little bit.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have time for maybe 1.5 questions from the audience. Just kidding. Probably have time for 2 questions from the audience. And so I will ask a couple that are coming out. You're getting a lot of shout outs in the chat. We have a question here that is, you all are amazing and inspiring. And can you say a little bit more about the specific practices that went into building communities of care within the program?
Definitely. Thanks, Chloe, for the question. Chloe's a city school alum. Some of the practices, some of the work that we've done around the practices of care are to have staff support many summers that are specifically focused on youth support structures within the program, and then also to invest more in training our staff across the board around both the Liberation Health model, but also collective care and organizing with care. Which is to say how organizing groups in history have used care practices in their organizing work and have met people's direct needs in organizing work. So that's a curriculum we do with both youth and staff. And that's been a really critical part of making the link that, as Amatullah spoke to earlier, collective care is not just an updated version of self-care, but actually an organizing strategy and preventing the co-optation there. The other thing I would add is that we have just loved doing these collective care challenges. So we have a few collective care challenges each week that families, groups take on, and in a very maybe non-caring but very fun way, they compete with each other to see who gets the most points for practicing collective care. So those will be things like doing a mutual aid process within your family group, or drinking water, but encouraging each other to drink water collectively. The summer was very hot, if everyone can remember back to then. So it was very actually important that we all hydrate. Educating peers outside the program about what you're learning in the program, following through on your commitments that you make in the context of racial justice, gender justice, queer justice work, following through on those commitments as part of collective care. So we do these challenges and encourage each other, young people encourage each other to practice collective care in that way. I can say a lot more, so I think I'll close it there, but
Okay,
it's been
great.
a lot of fun.
You had some initial questions related to preventing internal burnout throughout the process of this work, and I'm guessing that probably collective care plays a role in that. But are there other things in terms of strategies you're using to prevent burnout, and how do you engage with burnout in the work as you're going?
Yeah, I think I can maybe start here. I think that, as we mentioned in in the sort of conclusion of some of our research and some of the questions that we have, this is one of the questions we have, right? Particularly around burnout more largely, but like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about burnout? Are we talking about burnout from the systems, the people who are most directly impacted and affected by institutionalized oppression are dealing with, and the burnout that comes with that, and or the burnout that comes with working in particularly and usually grassroots nonprofits that are under-resourced, under-supported, undervalued, and you're working with folks who are also most directly affected. And so we're grappling with a larger question about, like, what does this mean for us? How do we think about it internally? And then what does that look like outwardly to the larger youth justice movement, but just like in movement in general? So I think I want to name that feels important, that we're grappling with this in this moment. But one of the, I think, clear ways in which we're thinking about burnout and like making sure to support folks is being able to name and clarify for people that burnout is a part of the work often, and that we have to create systems through collective care and other ways to make sure that folks are not getting burnt out. So for instance, this summer, we were very clear with everyone in terms of staff saying, you need to take a day off. We recognize this is a 7-week program. It is not okay for you to go the 7 weeks and then be like, I was completely exhausted. And for us to be like, well, we'll do better next year. Absolutely not. Take a day. If you need more than that time, let us know. Being able to be in conversation about the ways that people can get their needs met is really important. As well as being able to name when there are challenges and things that are coming up for people very early. We use a coaching and supervision model that says we want to be proactive in our work and the ways that we engage together. So I said to someone that I was coaching this summer, for instance, if you tell me about something 6 weeks from now, I will look at you like we are both confused because something could have been said 6 weeks ago, right? And so being able to engage in honest conversations like that, I think helps us to make sure that people aren't like, well, 6 weeks ago, I was battling with this thing and I never said anything. So creating space and room for folks to be able to engage, take time off, and get their immediate needs met, transportation, food, these kinds of like should be universal, but are considered really basic needs that we can make sure are being met.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Amatullah and Tara. If everyone could just join me, we're going to wrap it here, but you all know where to reach Amatullah and Tara at the City School. Reach out. When you sign up to volunteer, you can bring additional questions with you and engage. If you all just want to give a lot of love and your emojis to Amatullah and Tara, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Also, thank you to our insightful reflectors, Orion, Emmy, and Danny, really amazing, and our amazing behind the scenes research assistants, Rihanna Howard and Ashley Shen. Also lots of love for them in making this all roll smoothly, as well as our fearless leader, Dr. Don Belkin Martinez, woohoo. Thank you so much. One more reminder that if you are getting CEUs, you must complete, please complete your form using the link that Rihanna just put in the chat because she is just on it. Also, in the movement, we like to say that the path to justice is more like a marathon than a sprint. Take good care of yourselves. Take good care of everyone around you as well as yourselves, because we all need you to create the new world that we want to see. We all need each other. And so we hope to see you at our next Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series event on Thursday, December 15th, when my good friend and former colleague, Jean Wu, Professor Emerita at Tufts University, will talk about Asian Americans and racial capitalism. Our wonderful student research assistant, Ashley Shen, will moderate that session. And again, thank you and onward.